Wow, you guys have said good morning a lot today, so pat yourselves on the back. Now, for most of our lives, we have an understanding of danger, that it is something to avoid at all costs. The things that put us in harm's way are the very things that we resist. That which may cause us discomfort or disappointment are the things that we teach people how to navigate around and circumvent. Danger is what we guard our children against. It's why we hold insurance, follow street signs, and use caution tape. And all of this is helpful when we're talking about the physical world. Cliffs too high, edges too rough, speeds too fast, substances too strong. Our recognition of danger is what keeps us safe and healthy and protected. But what about when we're talking about something as dynamic and responsive, contextually and spirit-driven as doctrine, religion, and theological interpretation? The ways in which we understand God and live in response to God. When we come face to face with these issues and ideas, the fight or flight idea of danger doesn't seem to be sufficient as a metric for whether or not one should say yes or no. For more often than not, fear can call those things that require courage to be labeled as dangerous. To be called fearful and what must be avoided at all costs can sometimes be exactly where the Spirit is leading. Acts 1-3 are case in point. That's where we began our short series on the book of Acts. We met the disciples, getting used to the idea that Jesus is alive and coming to terms with moving from great fear to great joy to great hope. Hope that power as they see it, as they long for it, will be put back into their hands. But Jesus insists that the power and presence they are looking for and searching for is neither descriptive of who he is or who they will become. Instead, they must wait for the Spirit, and it is then that they will be his witnesses. From the spaces of the familiar to the places that are unrecognizable. This is not about conquest. Rather, this is about the act of speaking and living and breathing the message of the kingdom of God. It all sounds just a little bit dangerous. Then we have the waiting that ends with fire falling from heaven and rushing wind through and around and within those who have been called. Only for the Spirit's arrival to be not just for them, but for everyone. Those they have known, those they have seen, those they have overlooked, those who are deeply like them, and those who are very much unlike them. The Spirit's arrival announces that all are welcome as differences and similarities are brought together as they share everything in common. Radical generosity that insists there is enough and that the voice of the Spirit is far different than the power and control of the empire. The Spirit-filled are his witnesses, and they are ones who are called to be surrendered to love. Oh, how dangerous. And then there's this man, lame since birth, and he sees the disciples, and the disciples see him, and this encounter leads to transformation as one who never imagined they could be anywhere other than the far edges of society is now invited into the center ring. And not just invited as a spectacle, but invited to participate in the divine work of joining. The Spirit-led work of the outsiders finding space, the forgotten being remembered, the hopeless offered an abundance of hope. And in this moment, as the man goes from lame to walking, the powerful are uncomfortable, the crowds are curious, and the religious are determined to move Peter and John towards silence. Yet it is right here where the Spirit whispers and the Spirit shouts that to be one of Jesus' witnesses may require you to stand not simply in the spaces where danger lurks, but to also become one who is known and labeled as dangerous. Now, that's not something that I want to say amen to. It's not something that I want to jump and shout about, and it's not really how I want to live my life. But as ones who follow Jesus, what other example is there to follow? What else should one expect when early on Jesus gave metaphor after metaphor about the danger ahead? He told the disciples, "You will be hated." He insisted that if one wants to be noted as a follower, they must first accept to die. He mentioned that they may be persecuted. He even went so far as to say the very things and places that once nourished you, if they call you away from this dangerous life, if they call you away from a life that seeks to participate in the renewal of all things, if they call you away from the work of offering healing to the lame and sight to the blind, well, you will just have to choose what you hate. That which nourishes you but moves you away from being his witnesses, or that which keeps the blind from seeing, the lame from walking, the poor from rising, and the crowds from experiencing healing. Jesus insists that those who follow him are called to reject and move away from the stories and practices and ways of being that leave the blind untouched, the poor uncared for, and the lame unable to walk. But that kind of commitment, that kind of a devotion is nothing short of dangerous. And so as Peter and John heal the man who has been lame since birth, and the crowd surround them in wonder, they begin to tell the story of Jesus as this long prophesied about, awaited, and revealed Messiah. And those who have spent a lifetime protecting their faith, molding and shaping the ways people would and could believe, are frightened and defensive, as their imagination is limited by their interpretation and their own ideas around revelation. These are the ones who had for so long written the rules, kept the rules, and interpreted the rules, and Peter and John are not following the rules. And to those who have always been in control, to those who have always held the rules and thus held the power, this looks and sounds and feels dangerous. Luke says in Acts 4:2 that the religious leaders were quite disturbed that they were teaching people that through Jesus there is resurrection from the dead. In other words, God was up to something new. The Spirit was at work. The gospel was being proclaimed. The invitation of acceptance and inclusion and liberation was being offered, and they, the powerful, the rule setters, were uncomfortable, uncertain, fearful, and they sensed that this message, this teaching, this outlandish declaration was nothing less than dangerous. You've probably heard the kinds of questions that they probably asked. Well, what's next? If they start believing that Jesus rose from the dead, then maybe they will believe that they too can rise. Well, the Torah clearly says, in my interpretation, which is obviously the right interpretation, that the Messiah would look like one made in my image and my imagination. This Jesus talk is a slippery slope. Who knows where it leads? If we allow this, what next will they come up with? And so they do what we so often do when we are put face to face with change, with ideas and perceptions that scream danger. We attempt to use everything within our power to douse, to diminish, and to quench that which is dangerous. And in this case, that means that Peter and John are arrested. But when the power that you are working with is not of this world, when the power you are talking about is not able to be contained or maintained according to your whims and passions, when the power that you are operating in is not one that is man-made or seemingly made for some rather than all, When the power you are walking in both recognizes it is perceived as dangerous and thus makes you appear to be dangerous, you cannot lock it up. You cannot silence it. You cannot end it. You cannot quench it. You cannot contain it. And while Peter and John are being arrested, the Spirit is still at work. The crowds, the listeners, those clinging to their words, are leaning in just a little bit closer. They're asking just a few more questions. And on that day, the beautiful and sometimes dangerous gospel results in the church increasing to 5,000. Nothing short of a miracle in the eyes of some, but to others, this simply fuels their fears. And so the ones who did the arresting, they say with great joy, "This is dangerous." And the ones who have just been arrested shout out, "This is dangerous." And both of them are right for very different reasons. One speaks to the fear of what will be lost. The other speaks to the imagination of what God is doing. One asks that Peter and John be silenced, their message hidden, their words made invisible. The other insists that it is not the power of the powerful that will move or shape their next steps. Instead, they are moved by the Spirit. It is God who they obey, not men. The apostles are unafraid to be called and labeled as dangerous if they find themselves moving in the direction of where God is leading. If they find themselves moving where the Spirit is going and where Jesus resides. God is on the move, even towards places and spaces that appear nothing less than dangerous. But is the church courageous enough to follow? Willie James Jennings says this: "Speaking holy words has serious consequences. These are not words that simply speak of God. There is nothing inherently serious or holy or dangerous in God talk. The holy words that bring consequences are words tied to the concrete liberating actions of God for broken people. Such holy words bring the speakers into direct confrontation with those in power. Jesus not only spoke such words, but he was such a word. He was predestined to challenge those in power and confront the powers, spiritual and human. This moment was inevitable. Real preaching and authentic teaching is inextricably bound to real criminality." A few weeks ago, I sat in a coffee shop and I had a conversation similar to this. As one of my colleagues insisted that one of the things that is dangerous is when pastors go rogue. I think he was talking about me, actually. When pastors go rogue. When they go rogue on doctrine and they fail to understand the long-term implications of where they lead their congregations, whether through preaching or practice or reflection. And his words hold a measure of truth. But I realized as we were talking that what he called dangerous was not what I understood to be dangerous. He didn't see the ways in which the church keeps people from liberation as dangerous. He wasn't referring to the ways in which the church has protected abusers and abusive environments as dangerous. He wasn't referring to the ways in which the church has used doctrine as a means to promote doctrine as dangerous. He was not referring to the ways in which our protection of institutions supersedes our capacity to follow the Spirit. No, to him, the most dangerous thing was the equivalence to the religious and the powerful being threatened by the healing of a man born and able to walk. Liberation and freedom, inclusion and flourishing and blessing for all, that is what he insisted we should more closely monitor to ensure we avoid danger. And I reminded him that a look back through the church history shows that rarely do we consider dangerous the things that are actually dangerous. In other words, rarely do we choose to stand where Jesus stands and call out danger among the elite and the powerful and the strong. More often than not, our history would suggest that where we find ourselves is calling those things that are birthed of the Spirit dangerous, rather than those things that move us or our society or our churches away from the direction of the Spirit. From the days where the church demonized those who insisted it was the sun and not the earth at the center, to the insistence that those who were different than us were savages, demon-possessed, and less than human. The ways in which the church insisted that some women were witches and sanctioned their death by fire, to the ways the church used the name of God as a means to take land and civilizations to be less than good stewards of the earth. And what we did not do in those moments is call the violent deaths of those women, the ostracization of those who spoke the truth of science, the blatant dehumanization of those who were taken in the transatlantic slave trade, the sinfulness of those who insisted that churches and marriages and schools must be segregated, the lack of justice for women who were assaulted, the lack of empathy for those who find themselves immersed in addictions, the death of freedom fighters, the glorification of war, the celebration of power. What we did not do is call those things dangerously opposed to the story and the message and the person of Jesus. The church, for the most part, did not sense in the moment at these times of history that there was any danger in upholding these things that did not reflect Jesus. Rather, with all that we had access to in that moment, at those times in history, the church insisted that we should be labeled as dangerous when the conversations were about freedom, when the retelling of history came from the side of the oppressed, when the freedom of women to be more than ones who submit was declared, when the inclusion of those who do not fit was insisted on, when the defending of the poor and the defense of the environment and the defense of the least of these was what was preached. It was, and it is so easy to see those things as normal, as just the way things are, and as void of danger, rather than to insist that the real danger is found when power is preached over Christ, when winning is preached over Christ, when self is preached over Christ, when country is preached over Christ, when hoarding is preached over Christ, when the powers and principalities of this world are preached over the power and the presence of the Spirit. And so simply because something feels dangerous and perhaps elicits a sense of fear within us and makes us a bit uncomfortable does not mean it is not the move of the Spirit. For it feels dangerous to give voice to those who have been silenced, to stand with those who are being killed, to give the center to the marginalized, to offer hope where hopelessness has lived, to ensure equality and equity where it was once deemed impossible, to preach liberation as the message of salvation, to insist that dead things can come back to life again, and to participate vehemently in all things being made new. It is this invitation to be witnesses of Jesus that is so often called dangerous. Yet we are called to echo Peter in the face of those things which insist that religion and power and position and place have the final say. With this question, who should I obey? Who should I follow? Who should lead me? And what should order my steps? Man or God? To figure out what it means to be a follower of Christ is difficult work, because for so long we were told that it all centered on whether or not you made it to heaven. But Jesus did not simply come for a heaven-forward movement. Instead, he came to bring heaven here on earth. And whenever we participate in that work, those around us may call us dangerous. Those around us may insist that we should fall in line. Those around us may long for our doctrine to be their own versions of truth. rather than for our practice and our preaching and our living to be that of the Christ. But God is on the move. And the God who knew what it was to be dangerous as he preached the kingdom, as he stood face to face with the powers and principalities, as he demanded the religious let go of any religion that left some out, as he healed on the Sabbath, as he healed the very man who arrested him, as he faced the cross with forgiveness in his mouth, as he rose from the dead with the promise that all things could come back to life. If the Spirit leads us where it is dangerous, may we be known as ones who will follow. Willie James Jennings says this. He said, we should always understand ourselves as what Edward said called secular critics who unrelentingly call into question the gods of this age. That is the prevailing social, cultural, political, economic, and academic logics that support or are at ease with the status quo of grotesquely differentiated wealth and poverty, uneven access to the necessary resources for life and health, and forms of sublimely stubborn oppression masked inside social conventions. There will always be threats because they are the cultural currency of this world. Threats reflect the anxieties of the powers and the principalities having migrated in the hearts of those who believe they must control religious and political movements, rendering them innocuous and exploitable. We should never marvel at the threats. Instead, we marvel at the action of God. The kingdom of God is at hand. The worship team can come up. God is up to something new. God invites us to be surrendered to love, to see and to be seen by those who are among us and by those who surround us. We see danger, and we are called to be dangerous. May we not confuse the two, but instead be ones who marvel at the action of God among us and because of us. To be called dangerous, may that be our prayer. To be called dangerous, may that be how we are labeled. To be called dangerous, oh, that we would be. Let's stand together.